CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. To learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. We are here on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I want to pay my respects to all First Nations people who are here today and acknowledge all elders, past and present. So today we're going to have a presentation by Kerry Martin. Kerry is a visual artist in the final stages of a creative practice PhD here at the University of Canberra in the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. Her practice is motivated by the logic of a reparative aesthetic, an approach aimed to hold the viewer's attention on the difficult subjects she explores. Kerry works primarily with textile techniques. Her work focuses on manual methods, and she frequently employs the slow, repetitive process of hand stitching as a fundamental element of her work. Kerry consistently examines questions relating to the human condition and areas of social injustice. She's interested in how beauty, text, the repetition of mark making, and the multiplicity of display can be an impactful form of bearing witness. Now, for those of you who don't know, the work Kerry's going to discuss today is currently being exhibited at the Belconnen Arts Centre, about 500 metres away from here, just across the lake. And it's up till the 13th of October. I strongly encourage you to go and see this work. It's quite extraordinary. So please join me in welcoming Kerry.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, to elders past, present and emerging, for their history of care for the country where I am grateful to live, work and create, and for the ongoing culture, art and storytelling that is so generously shared. Just a warning that this presentation contains references to child sexual abuse. So thank you, Paul, for the invitation to speak today, slightly daunting though it is. I want to talk to you about my creative practice PhD. I'm almost there. The essay was submitted at the end of July. The accompanying exhibition, as Paul said, opened at the Belconnen Arts Centre on the 30th of August and runs till the 13th of October. And I believe my examiners will be conducting their arcane art very soon, or at least within the next 4 weeks. Also daunting. Firstly, 2 disclaimers. I'm not a Catholic, but I am aware of the significance of religious ritual and symbolism for those to whom it's important. When my sister, who actually converted to Catholicism on her marriage, died suddenly and completely unexpectedly just days before I went on a field trip to the Vatican Museum in 2022, I lit a candle for her in a small chiesa in Rome with honour and respect for the tradition, even though it wasn't my own. And when that same ritual was performed for me at St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne, before a nerve-wracking biopsy the following year, I was moved by someone's care for me and their faith in the power of prayer. And I tell you this simply to emphasise that although I have been incredibly and unsurprisingly critical of the Catholic Church's history of and response to child sexual abuse in this project, there's never been any intention to mock devotees of that faith or indeed religion more broadly. The second disclaimer is that I am not a victim of institutional child sexual abuse, and so I come to the topic with no lived experience, which is a first for me actually, in my art making, because up until now, I've always had at least one foot in the door of the subject matter I've been exploring. I became interested in Royal Commissions in an academic and arts-based sense in 2019. I had completed my honours year the previous year at the School of Art and Design at ANU, where I made a body of work about my mother's dementia, and she was living in aged care at the time, but died the following year. And in that year, as a graduate in residence at ANU, I began work on what was to become my first solo exhibition based on the Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety, and was thinking very seriously about doing a PhD, which, to be honest, I'd been thinking about since first semester of first year of my undergraduate degree, much to the amusement of some of my lecturers. To cut a long story short, I didn't do my PhD at ANU, and instead I landed spectacularly on my feet by doing it here. And I'm forever grateful to Dr. Karen Florence for my introduction to distinguished Professor Jen Webb, my wonderful primary supervisor, and for Jen saying, yes, we're interested in this research, put in an application. And I do as I'm told. Sometimes, occasionally, yes, occasionally. So my research explores how an artistic response to Royal Commission outcomes might act as a platform for continuing conversations around issues of social injustice, in this case, institutional child sexual abuse perpetrated by the Catholic Church. Supplementary questions examine how textile art can support the artistic response and whether the deployment of beauty as a strategy can stimulate and maintain interest in the subject matter. These questions were critical to me as both researcher and maker. They informed and tested my art practice, my position as a witness, my stance on the continued use of the reparative aesthetic in my own practice, which I had been using since I'd started practicing art, actually, but I hadn't been able to put a label on it, and the exploration of a gap in knowledge related to art, and specifically textile art and Royal Commissions. Central to my research are the findings of this Royal Commission. A high-profile national exercise in bearing witness to the failure of institutions to protect children in their care. It was in the voices and the narratives where my interests lay. Although a number of institutions were in the firing line, 15, I think, from memory, my focus was always going to be the Catholic Church. It was the institution with the largest number of reported cases of abuse. And for me as an artist, and for the purposes of this research, a textile artist, the Church's rich textile traditions were also a very big draw card for me. As I'm sure you know, Royal Commissions are the highest form of open inquiry used by the federal government and state governments in Australia. They're costly, they're long, but they're pretty comprehensive, although they don't and can't cover everything. In the case of this Royal Commission, 5 years, 17 volumes, 17 very thick volumes, 57 case studies, 409 recommendations, 21 of those specific to the Catholic Church, hundreds of days of hearings, thousands of witnesses, both publicly and privately, tens of thousands of phone calls and letters and emails. So this was a really massive exercise. Royal Commission reports can be mind-numbingly dense, and they can also be quite traumatic to read. These inquiries can have a huge impact, but they have no enforcement powers. It's the executive government commissioning them that decides what action can or will be taken or not. So from an artist researcher perspective, it's the undisputed publicness of them that make them such important and rich sources of data for art making and creative practice research. Author and commentator Scott Prasser refers to them as the ultimate information gatherers. But according to him, some have questioned their recent regularity as akin to a cult of the Royal Commission. There's been one every year between 2013 and now, I think with probably little sight of that not continuing. But as I've said, this is not my first Royal Commission rodeo, nor I suspect will it be my last. Watch this space. Can't wait for the next one. So yes, Royal Commissions are impactful, and I'm sure you'll be aware that the Veteran Suicide Royal Commission was handed down on Monday this week and received a fair bit of attention. But how long does the impact last? And what other mechanisms can be used to continue the conversations around shameful national history? For me, clearly, art is one of those ways. So the approach I used covered the key concepts I wanted to explore, who'd gone before me and what they did, said, made, what was I going to create, and what might I build on or discover. So I began my explorations around three key situating concepts. The reparative aesthetic, as promoted and analysed by Australian academic and art historian Susan Best. Her work was introduced to me by Dr. Ursula Frederick in 2018. Thanks, Urs. Finally did something with it. It just took me a while. This is an approach to art making that in part aims to reduce viewer guilt and shame when engaging with the artwork, and in doing so, strengthen the viewer's willingness to connect with and consider difficult subject matter. Then there's the place of beauty in socio-political art, and whether that's an effective and legitimate strategy for getting people to pay attention to horrible subjects. What it means to be a witness to and make art about trauma that is not your own and stories that aren't yours to tell. And just before confirmation, I added a fourth core concept, truth-telling as it relates to Royal Commissions. Prior to that, I'd really just been using it as a data set, and I'm blaming Bethany for that fourth inclusion, which actually changed the whole research question, so thank you. Now let's start with the artist as witness concept. Gosh, this caused me some early grief, quite a lot of grief actually. This was both an area of theoretical interest and a practical approach through studio practice. And in the context of this research, witnessing also, of course, applies to the eventual viewer of the art as much as it does to the maker. And this is particularly important in relation to the reparative aesthetic. Witnessing is a term that gets used a lot in an artistic context, although Best claims that it is a problematic terminology. And after months and months of slogging through the literature, I can only agree. It was pretty awful. So I'm an artist who wasn't present at the time of the crimes committed by the church. So certainly not part of Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment. In my own practice, I have often positioned myself as a witness in my honours research, observing, reflecting on and articulating through my art the emotional journey I took through my mother's descent into dementia. And I use the same personal reflexive approach in my aged care exhibition, More Than Words, although I did primarily use others' testimony in that body of work. This form of first-hand witnessing isn't a feature of my doctoral research, but I think I looked at every possible theoretical permutation of witnessing I could get my hands on. Primary witnessing, eyewitnessing, secondary witnessing, which is what Best uses, tertiary witnessing, moral witnessing, and bearing witness. It goes on and on and on. I won't bore you with the details, but I did have to ask myself what sort of witness I was, and did it actually matter? It did and it didn't, like most things. It did because throughout this research, I've always been very mindful that I'm interrogating other people's stories, that they're central. Early on, this caused me to question my moral and ethical right to make this work. And as Lindros and Muller talk about, to ensure that I didn't make art that resulted in, and I'm quoting here, the dispossession of survivors' intimate stories and memories. But artists have always attended to difficult social histories and contemporary events, covering the full range of human rights abuses, and child abuse is certainly one of those. So in the end, I came to the conclusion that I was simply acting as researcher / artist as distance witness, acknowledging and accepting that my separation from the subject matter, although rare for me, provided the opportunity for me to view the subject through a different lens to those who might address it from first-hand experience. And this is an example. So first-hand witnessing Doug Heslop's work. Doug's a survivor. And by one of those freakish serendipitous moments, I actually met him quite by accident a few weeks ago in Newcastle, where I was going somewhere, decided not to go, then decided to go again, and here was this man who I'd been trying to get in touch with so that to ask him whether I could have permission to use his images in my essay. He gave it, lovely man. So Doug's focus as a survivor and a first-hand witness in this work was on perpetrators, and mine was on commissioners. So, you know, we obviously have very different styles, but it just brought home to me the different positions you can take when you're coming from a very different witnessing position. So, as I've said, my research engages with this concept of the reparative aesthetic, best examined in relation to photography, and she positions it as an alternative to the long-standing approach of the anti-aesthetic stance of most political art. And, you know, if anyone's unfamiliar with that term, the anti-aesthetic largely rejects the use of beauty in art, or at least considers it unimportant, putting the meaning of the message of the art above any aesthetic component. So Best doesn't kind of classify what the reparative is, but I tend to think of it as a quiet, tender approach, a gentle provocation for the viewer, if you like, a whisper, as opposed to the more shouty tenor of the anti-aesthetic. I think both the reparative and the anti-aesthetic can and should be challenging, but I would argue that the reparative perhaps challenges us more cognitively, while the anti-aesthetic, at least initially, challenges us more viscerally, which is not to say, of course, that it doesn't then go on to cause us to think. As previously touched on, Best says that the reparative aesthetic can reduce viewer guilt and shame and strengthen engagement with the subject matter. She also says that the artist's secondary witnessing position, that is someone who's not a participant in the subject matter, allows the viewer to engage in thoughtful consideration of the issues, rather than simply act as a passive receiver of the artist's own experience or testimony. Now, having made work from both of these positions, using my own testimony in the case of the dementia work, and now in this project, using the testimony of others, I don't actually agree with Best on this point, and would go so far as to say that I think it's actually a little bit demeaning to both parties to believe that neither the artist nor the viewer is capable of distinguishing between personal trauma and a more universal understanding or representation of it. So clearly the reparative aesthetic is fundamental here, and so is the use of textile art as my chosen medium. My bachelor's degree in visual arts was in photography, and my honours was in textile art. So I think I'm well positioned to make a comparison between the two approaches, while, you know, loving both of them, of course. We're all familiar with photographs, and we are equally, actually, possibly far more familiar with cloth. It's been with us since birth. Although I was thinking the other day, in these days of social media, perhaps photography comes first before the swaddling these days. Here, let me take a picture of your naked baby on my naked breast. But I'd like you to consider these two artworks. The first one on the left is a piece of photographic art by Peruvian artist Milagro de la Torre. I hope I pronounced that correctly, analysed by Best in her book. And the other is one of my textile works, Where the Weight of Their Stories. I am completely aware of the irony of showing you a photograph of the textile work, but hopefully you'll get to see it in the flesh. So La Torre's work is of a shirt designed, however flimsily, to protect the wearer from firearm attack. The image was taken with a large format film camera, and if you've ever used one of these, you'll know the incredible detail that can be captured by them, you know, beautiful, beautiful pieces of equipment. And of course, this image in real life and not on a screen or reproduced in a book would, I'm sure, reveal much more of the shirt's texture and its additional reinforcements, which certainly aren't obvious here and what the point of the photograph is. But what interested me most about this was Beth's description, which said in part, a scale to the size of the body and set in a generous off-white field, the garments are hung singly on the wall as if offered to the viewer to acquire or try on. And it's here that I'd like to make the comparison. Although Beth says that the viewer might imagine trying the shirt on, I would argue that its textile equivalent would make this more likely. That is, if the shirt itself was hanging in the gallery and not an image of it. I'm not disparaging the photograph here by any means, but when I look at it, I get little sense of the weight or structure of the bulletproof elements, which is the whole point of that series of artworks. Where the weight of their stories, however, leaves the viewer in no doubt about its weight, its elements, or its construction. It's been designed to be viewed in the round, allowing the viewer to receive its message from multiple perspectives. Unlike an image where you're actually directed by how the photographer frames the object. So in my opinion, there's potentially a closer and importantly, a longer interaction with the artwork in this form, and therefore perhaps a greater deal of connectivity with it. You know, of course, there's a lot more detail in my object than there is in Latour's. I concede that, and that might be a factor in any prolonged examination. But I do know that people have gone searching for names in my work, so they have connected with it quite strongly. So beginning with English and German 18th century philosophers, beauty was the defining characteristic of the Western art canon until it fell out of favour in the early 20th century as the anti-aesthetic movement took hold, when the avant-garde rejected beauty's importance as the height of artistic merit. Or as art critic and philosopher Arthur Danto describes it, when beauty began to be thought of as bereft of cognitive meaning. So there's a direct implication here that the aesthetic is oblivious to, or at least irrelevant to the political, and that the more dominant anti-aesthetic holds the moral high ground, or the floral high ground, as I like to call it. Smells better there. It still holds a major position, but I'm pleased to say that there is a re-emerging interest in beauty, in socio-political art. But beauty is such a slippery thing to define, so I didn't try. I just described what beauty meant to me in my own practice. And this, of course, will be different for everyone. And, you know, what I think is beautiful in my work or others' work, you know, other people may disagree. It's subjective. But my research examines how an artist can respond to an issue and invest in the creation of artworks that facilitate continuing conversations around that issue through the delivery of artefacts that in part use beauty as a key strategy. And for me, this means an approach that doesn't rely on aggressive visual imagery to make its point. So my interest lies predominantly in artworks where any appreciation of their beauty by the viewer is aligned with cognition of the issues, where dwelling on and lingering with the object intensifies the impact in both contexts. You know, I wrote this in my essay and I still believe it's true. I concede that it might be counterintuitive to create aesthetically pleasing work that, you know, aims to continue a conversation that's as ugly as sin as child sexual abuse is. But I believe that beauty has the potential to provide an anchor for the viewer when they're in the process of contemplating difficult subject matter, that aesthetics and social politics aren't incompatible, but can successfully coexist for a specific purpose. In my case, that purpose is a continuing conversation about child sexual abuse. Necessary to my argument is that the use of the reparative aesthetic is that it doesn't deter viewers from sticking around long enough to absorb the message. Sometimes beauty might be seen as bland and uninteresting. I think that sustained attention requires that the art's neither too pretty, making it a bit boring or inconsequential, nor too aggressive, leaving the viewer repelled or forced to walk away. It's a very nuanced balance, I think, which is why I often incorporate text. On to the equally slippery topic of what is truth. Philosophers have been wrestling with this question for centuries, unadvisedly, if you believe British philosopher J.L. Austin, who said in his 1950 essay Truth that, quote, philosophers should take something more nearly their own size to strain at. I sensibly concurred with that sentiment and made no attempt to answer that particular question either. Recent Royal Commissions have been labelled as truth-telling inquiries, providing a process where people can share their experiences publicly or in private. Julia Gillard, who instigated this Royal Commission, said they deserve to have their voices heard. And this has been a key feature of subsequent Royal Commissions. So I was much less concerned with any definition of truth and more interested in the opportunities for people to have their voices heard and how I might respond to and indeed witness that. Many survivors took the time to respond to their experience of being able to tell their stories safely and, importantly, having those stories believed and acted upon. So Message to Australia is a component of the Royal Commission website comprising messages from people who experience the process. They provide there were, again, hundreds of them. They provide a compelling argument for the value of Royal Commissions and a strong indication that survivors want the conversations to continue, which is, of course, fundamental to my positioning of art as a platform for this to occur. And commissions of inquiry, even on the scale of this one, tend to slip out of community consciousness once a report is delivered and the media moves on to other things. They can, of course, re-emerge for short periods of time, such as, in this case, the coverage surrounding the death and funeral of Cardinal George Pell in January last year, and an ABC Four Corners program that reported on the legal tactics being used to block survivor access to justice. But it's largely left to advocacy groups to continue to agitate and hold attention on the subject. So why did I use textiles? I've already said I was attracted to the ecclesiastical textiles of the Catholic Church, and reference to these was a way for me to link the past with the present. It was a deliberate choice of mine to use items that have been largely unchanged in style for centuries, signifying the ingrained traditionalism of the Catholic faith. And as I kind of look at it, entrenched symbols and entrenched beliefs. This slide shows how I've taken the medieval scion cope as my starting point for one work and made my own contemporary version, which I'll talk about soon. Textiles have been a form of communication for a very long time. Textile art's been used throughout history to deliver visual testimony, make declarative statements regarding social and historical issues, and contribute to the archive of collective memory. On the top here is the detail of part of the famous Bayeux tapestry, misnamed, it's actually an embroidery. And under that, you'll appreciate this if you're a Game of Thrones tragic like me, is the eponymously named Game of Thrones tapestry, very inventive, modelled on the Bayeux, and it's a mix of weaving and embroidery, hand embroidery. Pardon me. At different ends of the time spectrum, 11th century versus 21st century, these two pieces of extraordinary textile art indicate a continuing interest in the art form, in its ability to depict narrative, to hold attention with its amazing detail, to be both contemporary and historical, and to celebrate the continuation of the laborious, time-consuming handcrafts, and of significance to my research, the longevity and appeal of hand-worked embroidery. There's always a starting point. Well, in my experience, a starting point when you're beginning to create a large body of work, as I have. Something that triggers the direction you'll take, and this was mine.
Are you ashamed?
I'm not ashamed now, mate. No, it's not mine. It's my shame anymore. George, have it. George, it's yours. Deal with it. I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm the Bernie I want to be, mate. You have the shame, mate. You have it all. I don't want it. I don't want it anymore.
I hope you're able to hear what he said. Sorry, it was soft. Never fails to move me, that clip. This articulation and Bernie's subsequent rejection of survivor shame was the lightning rod for my creative work. But it forced me to ask the question, how could I shift shame from victims and survivors and place it onto the church? And in doing that, might my artistic response add to the voices continuing to advocate for change, declarations of liability, and improved support for victims and survivors? So what did I come up with? I'm going to take you through each of the objects I created for the exhibition. At many times throughout this project, I've been struck by the amount of time each artefact has taken to complete. Thousands of hours and certainly tens, if not hundreds of thousands of stitches. But it served to remind me of the extraordinary amount of time survivors take to tell their stories. And the Royal Commission reported it took, I think, an average of 29.3 years to disclose, and how long they've lived with their undeserved guilt, shame and trauma. So this is the cope of commission. Instead of the saints normally found on medieval copes, I think in the Sion cope it was Saint Joseph. I might be wrong about that. I've embroidered the faces of Julia Gillard and the 6 Royal Commissioners as my notable figures. When I was lucky enough to talk to Commissioner Fitzgerald, I told him I'd done this, but said I'd refrain from giving them halos. He laughed at that, told me that the commissioners were fallible like anyone else, but that he was certainly proud of what they'd achieved, in particular the 8,000 private sessions they conducted between them. This particular work took me 540 hours to embroider, used 1.7 kilometres of thread, 61 mirrors, and goodness knows how many beads. I wasn't even going to begin counting those. I really wish I'd timed everything I'd made, but this was the only one I did, knowing that it was going to be a monster. Given the amount of time to make this work, I suspect it provides the most demonstrable evidence of the effective labour in this project, or the service aspect of it, and also mirrors the practice of so many women and men who have created textile work in service of the church for centuries. I was going to make 2, the saints and the sinners, but I saw sense. There was no way. Next to the collars, or the guilty series. So the Roman collar, often colloquially called a dog collar, is one of the most visible symbols of a priest or brother, even though you see, just a tiny part of it. We all know it's a white collar. And a key question for me was how I could change symbols of power and authority into symbols of shame. There are 28 of these collars with white writing, the top right, all saying guilty, but each with a different motif, and one black one on the bottom left. I chose the number 28 because that was the number of the Ballarat case study, Ballarat being at the epicentre of abuse. The collars are boxed in what I have referred to as a reliquary, and a reliquary is a container intended to protect its relic contents, usually the bones of a saint or the possession of a saint. They're usually very ornate. My choice to construct mine from clear acrylic supports the idea that the container should be secondary to the contents. And this containment was based on 2 ideas. Firstly, that the priest is considered sacred, and there was a lot of talk in the Royal Commission about how they were perceived as such, and therefore they were protected and untouchable. And secondly, or alternatively, that the priest is a danger to children and should be entombed, contained, controlled, or separated from them, which is why I boxed them. I could have simply embroidered all the collars with just the word guilty, but the additional elements, the embroidery and the pearls, serve a purpose to hold the viewer's gaze. If they were all the same, there'd be no point in examining each one, and therefore people would spend less time looking. And just as every collar is different, so is every perpetrator. The Pope's robes, nor my darling daughter guzzling champagne at the exhibition opening. This is undoubtedly the most literal representation of the church wearing its shame. It comprises the white cassock, shoulder cape and sash typically worn by the Pope, embellished with close to 500 names of victims and survivors. So essentially every story I read, I embroidered the name. As with most things, this was going to be something different initially. I was going to make a large banner with all the names on it, textile banners being quite common in churches. But I was reminded of these works, and sometimes decisions get made for you. So this is Kate Doherty's wedding dress, Agnes Richter's jacket she made and embroidered while in a mental asylum, and Do Hursa's the metal jacket, which comprises dog tags, military dog tags. So I was quite happy I went with the Pope's robes. It seemed reasonable to me, with my intention of shifting shame, that successive popes must take overall responsibility for the crimes committed under their watch. And in fact, the policy of papal secrecy effectively protected criminals for a very long time, and still does. Many people commented on the neatness of the stitch names, with some convinced they were machine stitched. They weren't. And in fact, I often unnecessarily told that there were machines that could be programmed to do the embroidery for me, which kind of misses the point. To ground the robes, I wanted to make reference to the red leather shoes worn by several popes, although I believe Pope Francis has discontinued the practice. I was struck by the fallibility of so many popes over this issue that the term feet of clay seemed to apply. So again, I went literal and I momentarily veered off the textile track. And here I'd like to thank Xiaolan and Karen Sorensen for their help in making these ceramic shoes, because I had no experience. The crack in one of the shoes was unintentional and happened before it went into the firing process, but I went with it. I actually really liked it as kind of analogous to and emblematic of the fragile foundations of the church. You know, I love a good mishap. A rosary is really a map for a series of prayers. I was moved to include a rosary, and this was actually the first artwork I made. And it was also, there were also going to be 3 of these. Again, this thing gave me frozen shoulder for a year after making it. There were many accounts describing punishment in the form of praying the rosary, typified by the following example of what happened when a survivor confessed the abuse to a priest in the confessional. Oh, sorry, that is that one. I'm not going to read it out, but I wish I could say this was unique. Unfortunately, it's not. So the rosary, or as I called it, the little children's dhofar, is an oversized but structurally accurate textile representation of the rosary carried by priests, brothers, nuns, and adherents of the Catholic faith. Because I'm not a Catholic, it was really important to me that I got the details correct. So this is what a rosary looks like, although it's 2.8 metres tall. The medallion depicts Saint Maria Goretti, who's the the Catholic patron saint of abused children. She doesn't wear a blindfold in any image, but I wanted to signify the church's systemised blindness to child sexual abuse, as well as make a reference to the legal profession's use of the Lady of Justice, and, you know, refer to the continued high level of civil litigation taking place and regrettably the Church's ongoing hardball approach to compensation. And I confess, I was also having trouble getting the facial features right. So problems into solutions. My intention for this piece was initially as a reference to George Pell. I was going to make, there's a lot of I was going to is in this body of work, isn't there? I was going to make 7 panels relating to the trial, the alleged offences and the subsequent quashing of his conviction. Apart from the length of time that would have taken, and this was my first foray into making lace, after the first central panel, I reread the Royal Commission reports, and not in any way dismissing Pell's negligence or alleged crimes, I decided that it would be more even-handed of me if I took a more generic stance, representing the church hierarchy and not simply one person. Pell, although significant and high profile, was just one of many men in positions of power who maintained a system, culture and structure that failed to protect children. Like I said, I also wanted to try my hand at making lace because lace features on many ecclesiastical garments, including those of altar server and choir members, usually but not always young boys, hence the title, The Altar Boys, which is also a reference to Suzanne Smith's book of the same name. How am I going for time? The altar cloth was a gift from a friend. It had come to him through his sister, who was a Brigidine nun. I'd been concerned that there was no reference to nuns within the body of work because they also played a part, turning a blind eye, covering it up, or in the worst cases, colluding, procuring, or themselves abusing children. I realised that this, using a convent-based altar cloth is a somewhat obscure reference to nuns, but it's one I was happy to live with. The quote I've stitched on it is an excerpt from the testimony by Archbishop Christopher Prowse, and I chose it for 2 reasons. It's an explicit apology and an acknowledgement of guilt by a senior member of the church publicly. Late last year, I realised that witnesses' words weren't manifest in the body of work, and as they had been to such great effect in my aged care exhibition, and I knew how well it worked, so I had to address this omission. This series of words embroidered on velvet, there are 14 in gold, were proceed from hundreds of published testimonies. So choosing 14 to accommodate gallery space, available time and my curatorial vision was pretty difficult. In choosing those that I did, I attempted to encompass the perspectives of the abused child, looking back as an adult and reflecting on their trauma, the parent, and through victim recollection, the perpetrator. Collectively, I've called this work a survivor's hymnal in recognition of the significance of the choir of victim and survivor voices that rang out throughout the commission process. Central, literally and metaphorically, to the work is a piece in black thread on black velvet. So it's hard to read, deliberately hard to read. And it's the biblical quote, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for to such belongs the kingdom of God," highlighting the hypocrisy of these crimes. And what is an exhibition without its viewers? Just a lot of stuff hanging on a wall. Because I have an ongoing interest in undertaking future research using Royal Commissions, I asked for and received ethics approval to collect anonymous, unstructured feedback to the materialisation of testament, using this offering pouch as the receptacle. And I'm really pleased to say people are responding. I think I've got just over 40 responses to date, and there's another month to go. What they're saying is for another day or for questions, but I couldn't resist sharing these 3 with you that got put in the pouch on the opening night. Start them early, I say. I love the dragon too. Okay, last slide. As I finish up, I would like to acknowledge the bravery of victims and survivors in telling their stories. My intention in undertaking this practice-based research has been to establish an argument for 3 key positions. Firstly, that art, using a reparative aesthetic, can effectively respond to and facilitate ongoing conversations around complex issues of social injustice examined through a commission of inquiry. That is, that the fusion of art and Royal Commission outcomes is a strong combination. Secondly, that textile art is a compelling and underused medium in this regard. And lastly, that the use of beauty is a legitimate entry point into and compatible with the genre of socio-political art. A few things I've learned along the way. Royal Commissions are incredible sources of information and narrative for the exploration and consideration of difficult and disturbing issues, largely because of the breadth and depth of testimony they receive. This was a very dark chapter in Australia's history, but it's still happening, sadly, and there is clearly a need for continued vigilance and attention. Years later, the findings of this Royal Commission are still shocking, and it's clear that conversation shouldn't end with the handing down of a report. My use of art and the logic of the reparative aesthetic was not an attempt to repair trauma. Absolutely impossible, and I am certainly not equipped or qualified to even go anywhere near that. Instead, it was an avenue for exploring and discussing it. The conversations I've had with gallery visitors and the feedback I've received are testament to that. No pun intended. Making art about a Royal Commission isn't very common as far as I know, and I'm pleased to say that, and I hope it stays that way because I want to own that space. I believe this research has explored the potential for a new way of seeing, knowing and understanding the difficult topics that Royal Commissions pursue in a way that acknowledges victim and survivor experiences, but most importantly, doesn't set out to retell their stories because the artist also has a voice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kerry. Comments or questions?
Thanks, Kerry, for a wonderful presentation of an amazing project and body of work and journey. There's lots there, obviously, but I'm sure we're all a little bit stunned and need time to process what our questions might be. And I guess one of mine just popped to the fore is really that point that you make about the importance of beauty as something that can sit alongside other modes of production or tactics or however you want to think about it, as a way of inviting discussion. And I guess one of the things that conscious of the dismissal of work sometimes by words, as you pointed out, like beauty, and the one that always stands out for me is, oh, it's very decorative. But getting to that is that, yes, these kinds of tools are accessible to some viewers in ways that conceptual art, for example, might not be. And this brings me to this question about the cube itself anyway. Like, is there a space that you can envisage this work going beyond the confines of the gallery to create another dimension of witness and testimony and discussion that might take a different direction, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the pieces of feedback I got said something simply like, I hope the Catholic Church buys every piece of this exhibition and displays it in their churches. Now, clearly that's not going to happen. I think I say in my essay too that, and which I didn't touch on here, that I've reimagined in some ways the Royal Commission as an archive, and that this work could also become part of the archive. Now, how that, yes, it's going to be in a thesis. My great desire would be for some of these pieces, and I think particularly the Cope, which has a very historical kind of context to it because it has Julia Gillard and the Royal Commissioners, that somewhere like the National Museum might want to have that, where you know, it could hang us alongside other things. But other than that, I'm not really sure. Part of me would like to tour it, but again, that's kind of in a gallery context. But my gosh, it's such a, I was just about to swear, sorry. It's such a difficult, it was such a difficult exhibition to mount. It would have to be done slightly differently, I think.
Thank you.
Hi, well done. Kerry, we started our PhD at the same time, so it's great to see one of us complete it. Yay.
Almost got to get examined yet.
Thinking about actually that question about where else to take it, how to share it. Did you during this process, or have you considered workshops about embroidery and bringing people in to, you know, dealing with, you know, certain communities and letting them, you know, helping them find a voice through embroidery? Is that something that you've tried or thought about?
I haven't tried it. I would try it. There are certainly people doing that. I think you've got to be a little bit careful about that, because this is not artist therapy, and sometimes I think that can stray into that. But, you know, stitching circles are, you know, have been used for centuries. Women in particular getting together, stitching, talking about whatever it is they might.
Yeah, that's what
talk
brought
about.
it to my mind, actually.
Yeah.
In that.
Yeah, I would be interested in doing something like that. And because this is the second of 2 Royal Commissions I've made work about, and I really am very keen to do a third, which will probably be the Veteran Suicide Royal Commission, because I was in the Defence Force. I'd actually like to write a book to tell you the truth as well. But yeah, it's I do think there is a space for hands-on discussion around issues. And, you know, I've been down to the gallery quite a few times since the exhibition went up. And every time I've been down there, there's someone been looking, and I've been able to have really wonderful conversations with them. Although I was told, Paul Keziah, who's not here today, who's also doing her PhD and works at Belco, apparently a man came and berated her for 40 minutes about my work. I said, you should have rung me, I would have come in. So, which kind of proves the point that it's meant to be about continuing a conversation, whether you like the conversation or not. But yeah, it's been really interesting. And I think it's only through those kind of deeper conversations that the artwork is just the platform for that. And in whatever form it takes, whether through its stitching workshops or artist talks, 28th of September, 2 p.m. artist talk. So yeah.
Kerry, I want to follow up what Rick said there. I can understand the difficulty with the term witnessing. And when you were talking about the work with the papal gown, wearing the weight of their stories, and you said that you hand stitched every single one of those names.
Yeah.
That possibly we can say you're being a witness to their story. I don't know, but it seems something more like dwelling with, just being in the space of the many, many hours that each one of those would have taken place. There's something meditative and about, I'm not sure what to call it, but
yeah, I actually write about that in the essay. And one sort of anecdote is that they're difficult things to read, these narratives. They're, you know, terrible, horrible, heartbreaking. And I always promised myself that I would limit the amount of time I read. So, you know, to kind of 2 hours at the maximum. This is in the early stages of the work. And one day I read for the entire day. And instead of going home and having a stiff drink, which would have been the obvious solution, possibly the most sensible solution, instead I actually wanted to go home and stitch those names of the narratives I've read that day. So It is meditative, but it's also, I also found that in the stitching and, you know, hand stitching is very rhythmic, and, you know, you can watch a lot of Netflix while you're doing it. I thought that I would actually be thinking about the stories, but in fact, the stitching took me away from the stories into something else. Or it might have been, okay, where do I put the, not so much with the names, which were time consuming but relatively simple to stitch. With other things, it was like, okay, where do I put this next stitch? What colour should I use? What sort of stitch should I use? It was about the technique rather than the subject matter, which I was really surprised by, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. There's time for one more comment or question. Steve.
Hopefully just a quick one, but would you then make a case that future Royal Commission should have an artist in residence?
Oh, what a great idea. It wouldn't be me because my work takes too long. I hadn't thought of that. How interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. And then, you know, how would you choose that artist? So, you know, when I hopefully get to do the veteran suicide one, I certainly don't want to make all the work. I would kind of recruit probably defence artists. And, you know, I guess I can call myself a defence artist, even though it's been a very long time since I was in the Defence Force. But that's a really, I might write that in the grant proposal. So what a really interesting approach. I mean, they do it in courts, don't they? But I think, you know, so much is televised. You know, of Royal Commissions now, they are public. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that one. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking of the artworks being another way to communicate to the people who are presenting to the Royal Commissions in ways that aren't always sort of vocal and present or in writing, but more perhaps reflective and a more, I don't know, again, it's sort of slightly venturing into the trauma management side of things.
I've just remembered too, when I was speaking to Commissioner Fitzgerald and, you know, and talking about the 8,000 private sessions, and he told me that a lot of people who came to talk in those sessions actually brought artwork with them as their way of communicating. But I also think, sort of in the context of what I'm doing is you know, making the work after the event as a way of continuation of the conversation, because, you know, while these things are happening, everybody talks about it, but then they just get forgotten, and survivors and victims do not want the issue to be forgotten. That's for sure. Yeah. Thank you.